B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Monday, June 15th, 2020. If you're self-employed like me, this may be a deadline for you to mail in your estimated taxes. But because all of the other deadlines were pushed back by 90 days, I don't actually know. But if you want to be on the safe side, send a little coin to the feds and to your state tax collector. Well, in a surprise decision, we are winding down to the end of the Supreme Court's term, and almost on a daily basis now, we're going to hear decisions being released. The big one, which will come at the end of the month, if history is any predictor, will be related to Trump's tax returns and other financial records. But in a surprise decision, and surprising because of the justice who wrote it, the court, in a 6-3 ruling, found that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits sex discrimination, applies to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, this comes at a time when the Trump administration is pandering to the people who get queasy about transgender issues by using administrative power to roll back protections that were introduced during the Obama administration. But this is the law. And the majority decision was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch. I never expected this from Trump's first appointee to the top court. He wrote, quote, "An employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender defies the law." And until today's decision, it was legal in more than half the states to fire workers for being gay, bisexual, or transgender. So this is a major, major decision that in the more than half of the states is going to be a new set of regulations and protections. So to see Justice Gorsuch write this, to see Chief Justice John Roberts join the so-called liberals on the court, this is a consequential shift since the retirement of the so-called swing voter, Justice Anthony Kennedy. Another quote from the majority: "An employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. It is impossible," wrote Gorsuch, "to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating against that individual based on sex." So Justice Sam Alito, a fellow Catholic of Gorsuch and Roberts, he's hopping mad. There's only one word for what the court has done today: legislation. The document that the court releases is in the form of a judicial opinion interpreting a statute, but that is deceptive. A more brazen abuse of our authority to interpret statutes is hard to recall. The court tries to convince readers that it is merely enforcing the terms of the Civil Rights Act of '64, but that is preposterous. Clarence Thomas also dissented, as you can imagine. Here's another good ruling from the court today, and this was a case where they declined to take up a case, leaving the appeals court and the lower court decisions standing. And it relates to California's Sanctuary Cities Law, which is formally known as the California Values Act. And again, Thomas and Alito wanted to hear the case. But this is real progress, because this lawsuit was brought by the Trump administration through the Justice Department. And I've been concerned that the court has been so deferential to Trump on immigration issues, allowing the Muslim ban to go into effect, allowing him to declare the phony emergency, that the wall has to be built and he could steal funds from other budget areas to pay for it, And they haven't technically ruled on that. They just allowed it to go forward until they get around to it. And I don't even think that's going to be before the end of this term. But what this means is that under the California law, local police are barred from notifying U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to find folks at ICE that they're holding a suspect. They're also barred from transferring a detainee to ICE custody unless the person has been convicted of a felony under California law, had been jailed for a felony within the past 15 years, or served time in the previous 5 years for a misdemeanor that could have been charged as a felony. Local police also can inform ICE or individuals when a judge has ruled that there is probable cause to hold that person for a violent felony. So the whole idea of this is that people who are living in California without documents do not have to remain underground. Or at least they don't have to be completely underground because, of course, they can bump into ICE in many other ways. But the fundamental idea here is that we want those without documents to be willing to call the police if they are a victim of a crime or a witness to a crime. So the law also blocks police from asking people about their immigration status. It bars officers from being deputized as immigration agents. It bars ICE agents from interviewing people in local and state jails without the inmate's written agreement in advance. I don't think it actually prevents ICE officers from loitering around courthouses, which has been a very annoying factor, at least here in California. Now, the bad move by the court announced today is that they refuse to review 8 separate cases presenting issues related to the doctrine of qualified immunity. Now, we've been hearing about that lately because it affects police officers, but other government employees and officials are likewise covered. And what it says is that individuals under qualified immunity are protected from civil lawsuits seeking money damages, except in the case where it can be shown that an official's actions violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. Now, the definition of clearly established is difficult to meet. So it generally means immunity, not just qualified immunity. And this is one of many protections for bad cops that deserves to be addressed, but it will, unfortunately, require action by Congress to address this set of issues. So we had another police shooting of a black man that led to unrest in Atlanta, Georgia over the weekend. And this case is not cut and dried. It's not, completely simple. And I'll just tell you before I detail the events that I believe it was an unjustified use of police force. 27-year-old Rayshard Brooks fell asleep in his car, motor running, doors locked, at a Wendy's drive-up lane in Atlanta. And the Wendy's people called the cops because he was annoying other customers who apparently were able to drive around him to get their burgers, but in any event, it led to a call to the cops. Now, when I heard about this on Saturday evening, it was an eerie reminder of a case in Vallejo, California, which was recently in the news where police shot an alleged looter who was on his knees with his hands up. He was unarmed, but cops saw a bulge in his belt that turned out to be the hammer he had used, allegedly, to break a window of a drugstore. And Vallejo was the scene just over a year ago, February of 2019, of a case where a black young man named Willie McCoy fell asleep in his car with the doors locked and the engine running in a fast food drive-up lane. And the trigger-happy Vallejo police, when they arrived, they tried to wake him up, and at first he was unresponsive. But they noticed he had a gun on his lap in plain view. And I believe there were more than 50 bullets fired into the car of Willie McCoy, and he died at the scene. In the case of Rayshard Brooks, when the cops rousted him, got him out of his car, there was a pretty lengthy exchange between the first officer, whose name is Brosnan, and Rayshard Brooks. Because the call came in at 10:33 Friday night, the cop arrived at 10:42. At 10:56, a second backup officer arrived. At 11:03, that's more than 20 minutes after the first contact with police officers, they frisk Brooks. He's not armed. Then they perform a field sobriety test on Brooks. That took about 7 minutes. And Brooks is compliant. He's talking with the officers, calling them Mister. And Brooks said he had been drinking, but he thought he was not too drunk to drive. So he tries to talk his way out of it by saying, hey, look, my sister's house is just a few blocks from here. What do you say I lock the car up and walk to her place, and we'll just, forget about all this? Well, 27 minutes after the first officer arrived, the results of a breath test complete, Officer Rolfe tells Brooks that he was over the limit. We don't have the reading from the breathalyzer. So then, as they attempt to handcuff Brooks and take him into custody, he resists, and he lashes out. The two cops wrestle him to the ground. They warn him, you're going to get tased. And Brooks seizes one of the tasers from Officer Brosnan. He stands up and punches the other cop named Rolfe. Rolfe fires his taser at Brooks. The dart hits Brooks, and the cop, Officer Rolfe, fired another couple of rounds of taser fire. But at this point, Brooks, who had grabbed the other guy's taser, runs away, turns at one point to tase Officer Rolfe, doesn't appear to hit him, and the next thing we know, Brooks has about, from the video that I saw, it looked like he was about 18 to 20 feet away and running away, and Officer Rolfe pulled his handgun, fired 3 shots, and you see Brooks crumble to the ground. Now, while I don't think Brooks is any kind of a saint here, he should not have resisted. He shouldn't have gotten into that fight. He shouldn't have grabbed the taser. But he posed no immediate threat to either Officer Rolfe or the other officer named Brosnan. And I also would argue that he was running away. And officers are trained not to shoot a fleeing suspect unless they pose immediate risk to the cops, or, I believe, to anybody else in the area. And in this case, by pumping those 3 bullets out of his gun and toward Brooks, Officer Rolfe put other customers at that Wendy's at grave risk, because there was a lineup of cars and Brooks was running toward and kind of between. It looked like he was going to cut between a couple of those cars when he was felled by the gunshots. So this led to the resignation of the police chief in Atlanta on Saturday night. The district attorney has said that based on the coroner's very quick results, that he will make a decision by midweek on whether to file criminal charges in the fatal shooting. The mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, fired Officer Rolfe already. Brosnan has been suspended. And the district attorney told CNN that the possible charges against Officer Rolfe include murder, felony murder, and involuntary manslaughter. And the DA had this remarkable comment. He didn't seem to present any kind of threat to anyone. And so the fact that it would escalate to his death just seems unreasonable. And the family of Rayshard Brooks is calling it a murder. They want it tried as such. And Erica Shields is the police chief. I believe she's been running the force there for 3 or 4 years now. And she decided to resign after this episode and the one during the protests a couple of weeks ago, where the officers pulled that young couple out of their car with tasers blazing and a lot of brutality. So we'll see if the quick efforts by the mayor and the DA are satisfactory to the people of Atlanta. I certainly can't judge that from here, but I hope that calm will be restored in short order. So in a move that I regard as insincere, Trump is expected to sign tomorrow an executive order to establish a database to track instances of excessive force among police officers. And as you may know, there is still no official FBI database that even captures the fatalities caused by police officers using their weapons. It's described as an executive order with modest directives, relatively muted when it comes to sweeping police reforms that have been discussed by members of both parties. So I think it's just another one of those photo ops where Trump sharpies his big fancy signature onto a document and smugly holds it up for the camera. In Albuquerque, political leaders said today that the city will take money from the budget of its scandal-plagued police department to create a new community safety department. And I want to underscore this for the people who pompously condescend to the protesters who have used the slogan, defund the police. The latest are Bill Maher, who devoted quite a bit of time on his Friday night show to this, and former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown, an African-American, who used to be much more of a fighter for justice. But they all tell him, this is a bad phrase, doesn't poll well, it's going to be, used as a weapon against you. But defund the police, as I've argued, doesn't mean zero out their budgets. It means different things to different people. I acknowledge that, and it gets twisted by opponents. I acknowledge that. But one of the best arguments from, what's his name, Radley Balco, who was a guest on Maher's show on Friday night, and he made the case that if armed police officers did not conduct traffic stops, the provocations of police violence would be sharply and measurably reduced. And so if we use parking attendants or other unarmed police cadets who do the ugly business of citing people for, expired plates, speeding, I think it could make a big difference. And here in California, I will precede this by saying that I'm skeptical, but the big three police unions, San Jose, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, ran full-page ads in major papers across the state yesterday saying that they are pledging to root out racist cops. Not only that, they're saying that they support a national database of former cops fired for gross misconduct, a national use of force standard that focuses on de-escalation, a warning system to identify cops in need of additional training and mentoring, a public website that would allow people to track use of force incidents, and frequent crisis intervention and de-escalation training. Now, I am particularly biased against the San Francisco Police Officers Association because, like we saw in Buffalo and in Philadelphia last week, they are over-the-top aggressive in defending bad cops and in preventing ordinary investigations and public transparency about who they are and what they've done. And I am skeptical. I say to these police officers' unions, you've got a lot to prove because you have been a major part of the problem, protecting bad cops and enforcing the omerta, the code of silence among officers that you do not snitch on each other. And as you know, I consider that to be a fundamental flaw in our police culture in the United States today. But there's still a lot of bad shit happening. Palmdale is a sparsely populated, remote part of sprawling Los Angeles County. It is largely African American in its population. 24-year-old Robert Fuller was found dead in the square across from City Hall last Wednesday morning at 3:39 a.m. He was found swinging from a tree with a rope around his neck. Now, the severely tainted Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, they have a pretty dodgy sheriff there named Villanueva, I think. Well, they have said that this was a suicide. Now, there's no evidence to support that. There was no, like a chair or a ladder or some sort of a booster where he could have secured the rope in the tree and around his neck and then stepped off whatever riser or whatever you want to call it. Nothing. He was simply found in lynch mode, swinging from that tree across from City Hall. So the Sheriff's Department has called it a suicide, and the city officials in Palmdale, they're skeptical too. In a statement, quote, the city of Palmdale joined the family in the community's call for justice, which includes a full investigation into his death. The city will settle for nothing less than a thorough accounting of this matter. And this is one of those cases where you can say, well, the L.A. Police Department is pretty bad. They have a really sordid record. Let's shut them down and put Sheriff Alex Villanueva in charge. But as I say, he is a dodgy guy who has not cooperated with the new state law requiring disclosure of the files of police officers who have been disciplined or fired for wrongful behavior. And the family says, look, he was a happy 24-year-old. He had no reason to commit suicide that anyone is aware of. And again, just the description of how he ended up hanging from that tree without the, actions of some others is very hard to believe, just on the face of it. And then we have a case of a transgender woman who died at Rikers Island. That is the lockup facility of New York City. It is actually, I believe, on an island. And this woman, Laylene Extravaganza Kubalet Polanco, age 27, suffered from epilepsy. She had 2 seizures while she was locked up there because she was unable to post $500 bail on a charge of prostitution. And this speaks to our ugly cash bail system, which many people are working to reform right now. So she was put into solitary confinement, punitive segregation, and the cops were supposed to check on her routinely. And according to the logs of the jail, there's a 47-minute gap on this particular day, 2:27 p.m., and at 2:45 p.m., they entered Polanco's cell, and on the video that has just surfaced, both of the correctional officers crack up laughing. Now, they have found her dead, or at least unresponsive, with some barf on her face, and nobody at this point can explain what they were laughing at. But her paperwork clearly showed that she was prone to epileptic seizures, and this is at least a case of gross negligence. I don't know how many people watch Saturday Night Live still. It's been on for 45 years, so I'm sure many people have fallen out of the habit. But for a while, there was a black actor on there named Jay Farrow. And he's gone public with a story saying that in a recent encounter with L.A. cops, they drew their guns, they handcuffed him, and one of the cops put a knee to his neck. 4 officers stopped him. He was walking down the street listening to some music on his headphones. He said, he's looking at me, I'm thinking that he's making a mistake, I'm looking at him, and I'm looking past me because I'm like, whoever they're about to get, it's about to get terrible. No, he was coming to get me. And this shows that this kind of police behavior isn't limited to Minneapolis. Last Monday, I reported an incident that had occurred the night before in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle, where protesters were active and a man drove his car into the crowd. And I believe that I correctly reported in the podcast, but incorrectly reported in the show file for the show, that the protester who was shot by the driver of the Honda Civic had died. His name is Dan Gregory, and he has in fact survived, and I want to thank Paul Leto, who lives in Seattle, or in the metropolitan area there, and he wrote me a note over the weekend to bring that to my attention. But this is one of 19 cases in the past few weeks in which witnesses or police say civilian vehicles were driven through massive demonstrations. In at least 8 of the events, a driver faces charges for what prosecutors described as a deliberate act. And one of them happened in Richmond, the suburb of Lakeside. Rachel Kurtz said her husband, and 11-year-old son had to leap to the sidewalk and out of the path of a blue pickup truck. In Gainesville, Florida, Emily Bloom said she barely had time to dive to safety before a gray Kia with its engine revving was driven through the intersection where she had stood protesting police brutality. In Illinois, a motorcyclist was charged with hate crimes and aggravated battery after police say he plowed into a demonstration in Bloomington. And these all appear to be copycats of the 2017 vehicle attack in Charlottesville that killed Heather Heyer. And I think this speaks to the impact of television coverage. People get their ideas, and some people are prone to act on them. We had a Karen event last week here in San Francisco, in one of the ritziest neighborhood, Pacific Heights. As the name implies, it's up on the hill, has stunning views of San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge, and prices that are higher than the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge. So there's a man named James Juanillo, who I don't know his source of the wealth to live in Pacific Heights, but he owns a home there. And a bay window displays a sign, Black Lives Matter, and he had used chalk to write Black Lives Matter along a wooden retaining structure in the front of his house. And then Lisa Alexander, who is CEO of a cosmetics brand, was walking by with her husband. I think his name is Bob. Bob started his camera phone video and captured the event, and so did James. And Lisa was the antagonist here. And she said to James, what are you doing here? Because you're defacing private property. And James was a little coy. He didn't actually say, I own this place, bitch. But he could have. Instead, he kind of just let her give her spiel in a Karen style. And she and her husband asserted that they know who owns the house that James had chalked up Black Lives Matter on. And so ultimately he challenged them to call the police. And they said, she did, Lisa, yes, we will do so. And I want to acknowledge that she was fairly polite. There was no name calling, but she was being a nosy neighbor. Now, it's important to note that the police did come, and the officer actually knows James Juanillo. He's Filipino, by the way, and identifies as a person of color. So Lisa Alexander has issued an apology. Quote, there are not enough words to describe how truly sorry I am for being disrespectful last Tuesday when I made the decision to question him about what he was doing in front of his home. I should have minded my own business. Now, I'm content to leave it there. But there are all kinds of shaming mobs on the internet. Lisa Alexander is CEO of a company called LaFace Skincare. Well, there is a place in Los Angeles called My LaFace Cosmetics. They don't appear to have any connection with Lisa Alexander or her company. But they've been getting flamed on Twitter and, I guess, via emails and phone calls. We don't know her. We viewed the video and she made a big mistake. But look, I'm not Lisa. I'm not LaFace Products. My business is in L.A., and we've got some people writing back saying, we're sorry and we'll delete it right now. And James Juanillo says, for me, this experience has left me feeling vindicated and validated. I imagine that she regrets those couple of minutes. Do I believe that her life should be destroyed over this? No. I just hope that she realizes that what she did was racist and she can improve from this incident. Well, I think that's very generous. And I don't believe that people's lives should be upended for one moment of indiscretion or thoughtlessness. And I can't run this down. I haven't seen it in print yet, but I heard a pretty solid report that her husband, Bob, has been fired from his place of business as a result of this. And I don't see how a personal interaction like this, as distasteful as it might be, should have those repercussions. I want to recommend, if you haven't seen it already, HBO's John Oliver, his show Last Week Tonight, did a brilliant job of exposing the use by police of facial recognition. And this software, which is still in its infancy, has nevertheless allowed private companies and public agencies to collect billions of images of people. They scour our social media. It's one of the reasons I use a photo on Facebook of myself with goggles on. It's a ski photo. But with my big nose and my beard, I'm probably fooling myself to imagine that would defeat any kind of facial recognition software. But I do recommend that you look at it. I think it's too late. They've already got the pictures. The cameras are everywhere. But the false positives of identifying Asians and African Americans are at stunning levels. Apparently, white males like me are the easiest to match up when you compare a new photo with one from databases. And I also shudder. I'm not doing any international travel right now, but every time you come back into U.S. Customs, they basically trick you into capturing a fresh photo. They say, oh, yeah, take a picture here at this kiosk. It's not required, but it'll speed your processing when you get to the agent's booth. Big brother everywhere. I want to thank John Zwiebel, our dedicated listener in Hawaii, who tipped me off. I hadn't seen this. But there is a new 5-minute excerpt from a film called Seven that is being screened on PBS affiliate stations around the country. I have not seen it on my local PBS, but honestly, I just watch the PBS NewsHour and I DVR it, so I don't see all of their breaks. But this is a report on the recent scientific study into the collapse of Building 7 at the World Trade Center on September 11th of 2001. And this is seen as the keystone to unraveling what really happened. And if you're a fairly new listener, you may not know that I am a truther of sorts. What I know is that we don't know the truth about what happened on September 11th of 2001 in New York. We haven't been told the truth about Flight 93. And it's still a mystery what happened at the Pentagon. But the least controversial case is the collapse in less than 10 seconds of Building 7 at 5:20 or so on the afternoon of 9/11. There had been some fires in the building, but it wasn't hit by an airliner. And there's absolutely no reason for it to collapse. So I am surprised, as we approach 20 years since that fateful day and the cover-up of the 9/11 Commission, which I witnessed myself, that PBS stations are willing to air that. It was produced by Dylan Avery, who gained some visibility or notoriety when he and a friend produced the Loose Change film series back around 2005 or so. Well, Facebook is at it again. Its algorithm censors took down a photo claiming that it was featuring nudity. In fact, it was a picture from the 1890s of Aboriginal slaves who were chained together and all wearing loincloths. What is interesting is I have a friend on Facebook, Gary Chu. He's over in Sacramento, and we trade notes once or twice a week. And he lives in an apartment complex where there's a new resident who likes to hang out only wearing a Speedo. So Gary found a photo somewhere of some guy who has a big package in his Speedo. And he posted it online the other night, and I said, this is geezer porn, Gary, and if I knew how to turn you in, I would. And then comes this story. Well, Caitlin Johnstone, in one of her most recent essays, headlined Narrative Control Operations Escalate as America Burns, pulls together the details that we started with on Friday, that the Gray Zone independent media outlet, founded by Max Blumenthal, has been downgraded by Wikipedia. The Wikipedia is essentially censoring, calling it a deprecated source, and this was caused by Venezuelan regime change activists who don't like the coverage of the scene in Venezuela by the Gray Zone. There's been no evidence that there was any kind of false reporting. But the Gray Zone is not alone. Mint Press News, Telesur English, and other outlets are getting the same treatment. And Johnstone details how this is happening. That Twitter deleted 170,000 accounts recently, claiming they were tied to the Chinese government. And she writes, this all comes out as we learn that Facebook is attaching warning labels to posts from outlets sponsored by governments which have not been absorbed into the U.S. centralized empire, like RT and CGTN, but attaching no such label to outlets funded by imperial governments like BBC and Radio Free Europe. There is not any discernible difference in the degree of bias shown in state media from unabsorbed nations like Russia and China than there is in state media from the U.S. and UK. But Facebook causes its 2.6 billion active users to look at one with suspicion but not the other. And former Australian Foreign Minister Bob Carr has slammed the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a think tank geared explicitly toward fomenting anti-China sentiment in Australia, for pushing a one-sided pro-American view of the world. And Johnstone says this blatant imperialist narrative manipulation operation are the experts that Twitter consulted in determining which accounts were tied to the Chinese government and needed to be silenced. And there's an Iranian activist who notes that Donald Trump retweeted a comment from an account belonging to the MEK terrorist group, which has friends in high places in both parties in Washington. So it's an important piece. And we are living in an era of creeping censorship and creeping fascism. And America's overt propaganda machinery, the Voice of America, well, as you've heard us cover, Michael Pack, who is a movement Trumpist, was finally confirmed after dangling for over a year and a half before the Senate to head the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which runs Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America. And this has led to the resignation of two top editors at VOA Today. They didn't give explicit reasons, but over the weekend, Amanda Bennett, who has a distinguished background in publishing, she ran the Philadelphia Inquirer for a while, she resisted an effort by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, telling its communications staff to deny interviews to VOA reporters. This appears to be at the behest of the White House, and it also explains whatever happened to Greta Van Susteren, the former Fox News host. Well, she has been working as an anchor on the Voice of America. And the CDC specifically said, as a rule, do not send up requests for Greta Van Susteren or anyone affiliated with the Voice of America. So we're going to get that propaganda machine running right now. Far right. Every day I like to remind you that we have funds in the Peter B. Collins Community Fund, offering $100 grants to listeners or people referred by listeners who could use $100 right now. Our standards are pretty loose. You send me an email, and as long as I think you're honest, I'm going to send you $100. And today I'm mailing out a check to Joseph Havison. We mentioned him on Friday. He's been a longtime listener. Never misses a podcast, he says, but he's a jazz musician with no gigs. And if you're in a similar situation, whether you're a talented artist or just an average person who is really struggling to make ends meet right now, don't be shy. Drop an email to peter@peterbcollins.com. And we have several $1,000s remaining in the fund. And I'm not asking for any new contributions. I said we would do this through today, June 15th. But we will keep accepting requests for grants as long as there is a need and we have the funds to dole out. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, the caseload is up to 8 million now. There are 434,000 reported deaths. We have more than 2 million cases in the United States, 2.1 million, and coming up on 116,000 deaths. Well, China has reported 49 new coronavirus cases, and 36 are in the capital, Beijing. A meat and vegetable market is implicated in the outbreak. Authorities closed that market, ordered testing of workers, and have reversed relaxation of some social isolation measures. Europe's borders are reopening for Europeans. Americans still are not invited to travel there. Today, borders opened up with some restrictions after being closed for about 3 months. And we are told that actual outsiders are not invited until at least the beginning of July, if not later. Well, the CDC lists groups at higher risk for severe illness with coronavirus exposure, and it includes people with underlying diseases, those who live in nursing home and long-term care facilities, people over 65. But one at-risk group that's rarely mentioned is non-English speakers. And this is a problem because unless they speak a language that has a media outlet in their language, many people wouldn't know what's going on. And this surfaced in Hidalgo County, Texas, which is 92% Latino, where some residents learned about stay-at-home orders from cops who wrote them citations for unknowingly violating the rules. And we know that Hispanics are second to African Americans for proportionate exposure to this coronavirus. Also, the FDA is now tipping the seesaw. It's gone back and forth over the use of hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19. And as we've reported, there are doctors and some scientists who have attacked the data that's been used that led the World Health Organization to withdraw its endorsement of HCQ. And I know a lot of smart people who believe that it is useful and that if the side effects don't afflict those who use it to treat malaria or rheumatoid arthritis, how can it be so dangerous to cause heart problems for COVID patients? And I still don't have an answer to that question. But the FDA said recent clinical trial failures mean that chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine may not be effective to treat COVID-19, and their potential benefits do not outweigh the risks. Well, since I last spoke to you on Friday, Trump blinked, and this is rare. He's the guy who never backs down, never thinks twice about things. But he said that his black friends, and how many can there be, told him that it was, bad optics to hold a rally in Tulsa on Juneteenth. So he has blinked and he has moved it back one day to hold it the day after Juneteenth. And according to his campaign manager, Brad Parscale, there have been more than 1 million requests for tickets to the Tulsa rally. Really? The venue holds about 19,000 people. And Parscale has said that the people who come to the arena will be given temperature checks, handed masks and hand sanitizer before entering the arena. And, of course, to get a ticket, they had to agree to waive any liability claims against the Trump Campaign Incorporated if they come down with the coronavirus. Well, some leaders in New York and Texas are threatening renewed lockdowns in an effort to get people to take the persistent threat of the virus seriously. New York Governor Cuomo said the state's been deluged with 25,000 complaints about businesses that are in violation of the reopening plan. In Houston, officials warned last week that a lockdown might be reimposed as cases continue to climb. The medical director of the Special Pathogens Unit at Boston University of Medicine said that the rise in cases in some states in the South and West suggested that we opened too early in those states. Alarms are being sounded in Pakistan because since May 9th, the number of cases has quadrupled from 25,000 to 100,000. Hospitals are full. Doctors and nurses are falling ill at alarming rates and coming under physical assault from desperate and angry families. The CDC has started to hold regular briefings. They don't get invited to the White House anymore, and neither does Dr. Fauci. And they have released 2 new documents. One is called Considerations for Events and Gatherings. The other is called Deciding to Go Out. And these are handbooks, guidelines for people to consider. I have linked to them in the show file for this podcast if you would like to avail yourself of their knowledge. Inspectors General, 2 of them, have warned that the Trump administration is blocking scrutiny of the bailouts related to COVID-19. Government watchdogs warned members of Congress last week that the previously unknown Trump administration legal decisions may block their ability to oversee more than $1 trillion in spending. And it's clear that Trump Co. and Steve Mnuchin in particular are playing games. They say, oh, yeah, we're going to have a guy from the White House staff serve as our inspector general. But the congressional committees have been stymied. Carolyn Maloney, Democrat of New York, chairs the House Oversight Committee. They seem to be saying one thing while doing exactly the opposite. If the Trump administration is committed to full cooperation and transparency with taxpayer dollars, it's unclear why it's manufacturing legal loopholes to avoid responding to legitimate oversight requests. And there's even more money in the pipeline as they're starting to use the Federal Reserve to buy debt, that's bonds, issued by individual corporations. This generous buyback is called the Secondary Market Corporate Credit Facility. And I don't really understand the finer aspects of these economic machinations. I just know that the grifters are taking more of our money, and the people who really need a bailout are being left behind. Finally, today, I want to recommend the latest piece by my friend Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, founder of VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, because in a piece published at Consortium News today, he observes the 4th birthday of Guccifer 2.0, and he recounts the timeline back in 2016, where out of nowhere, Guccifer appeared. Guccifer, whoever it is, was offering documents. And Guccifer got in touch with WikiLeaks. This all happened in June of 2016. And by July, when WikiLeaks had released a lot of those documents that it says it never got from Guccifer, well, the impact of the documents was muted. The whole sordid story of how the Democratic National Committee under Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the treasurer who worked for both the Clinton campaign and the DNC worked hard with John Podesta, the chair of Hillary's campaign, to prevent Bernie Sanders from winning the nomination in 2016. That was the sordid story that came out of those documents that we believe were leaked and not hacked from the Democratic National Committee computers. And Ray recaps that it was December 5th of 2017 when Sean Henry, an executive of CrowdStrike, said, oh, yeah, we examined those computers, but we never found evidence that any documents were exfiltrated over the Internet. And that big lie that was the foundation of Russiagate. Yeah, the Russians hacked the DNC. Mueller even knew exactly which ones did it at the GRU in Moscow because he indicted them, right? Well, indictment is not evidence. And that was a ruse in the limited hangout report from St. Bob Mueller that stands to this very day. I encourage you to read Ray's piece and share it with your friends if they have even a shred of skepticism. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it everywhere, even at the DNC. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.